Ordinance Committee meeting of November 11th. Ms. Wan, would you call the roll, please?
Yes. Councilmember Rouse?
Here.
Councilmember Hotchkiss?
Here.
And Councilmember Maria?
Here.
Thank you.
Okay. And I don't really see a lot of public comment, so I see there is none. Can we go ahead and begin with the presentation? Mr. Toth.
Thank you very much. I'm making a brief presentation on our Muni Code, our Municipal Code Title 16 update. It involves liquid and industrial waste disposal into the city's wastewater collection system and then for treatment at the Elistero Wastewater Treatment Plant. By way of background, our MPDS permit, our National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System permit, requires local agencies to implement an industrial waste pretreatment program. Our NPDS permit is centered around the Elistero Wastewater Treatment Plant, and it also includes our wastewater collection system, which is also covered by a state waste discharge requirement system. And so in order to regulate the types and volumes of waste that come into the wastewater treatment system, we implement an industrial waste pretreatment program, and we do this through our Municipal Code Title 16 Ordinance Language. Our language was last updated in calendar year 2005. The EPA updated its model sewer use ordinance language and created a ordinance template for all local agencies throughout the United States to use. They did that in the 2006 timeframe. And since then, they are requiring agencies to update their ordinances to comport with the structure and language of that model ordinance. And so, in addition to our need to do that, we've had routine regulatory agency inspections, and these are consultants that are hired by the state and regional water quality control boards to do routine regular audits of our industrial waste pretreatment system. They do this audit about every 2 years. And in so doing, they've noted that we need to change the language in our ordinance to comply and comport with the model ordinance that was developed by the US EPA several years ago now. And so our proposed update to Title 16 ordinance does all of that. And so the reasons for the update, again, are straightforward. We're going to adopt the general structure of the US EPA 2006 Model Sewer Use Ordinance. We're going to implement additional requirements resulting from routine compliance inspections that were conducted by consultants to the state and regional water quality control boards. And then we need to make minor changes in language consistency in the updated ordinance to adapt to the model ordinance structure and then to make sure that we have all the language meeting together inside the ordinance to comply with routine compliance inspection ordinance language changes. The benefits of this update are that it strengthens and clarifies the city's legal authority to enforce against industrial waste discharges within the city. It allows also for streamlined implementation of city activities involved with industrial users. And by that, it's largely involved with enforcement for times when we need to do enforcement activities with our industrial waste discharges. And there again, we maintain compliance with our regulators' requirements. Now that pretty much gets us to what we're trying to do today here at the Ordinance Committee. And so what we're really seeking is that the Ordinance Committee review these amendments to the Municipal Code Title 16 and forward these proposed amendments to City Council. What I'd like to just take a second to do is to talk about activities that we have planned in our industrial waste pretreatment program that involve Title 16 ordinance updates next year, what would be coming next year in the future. And what we're working to do is to conduct an update of our sampling program and analyses in the wastewater collection system and in advance of the treatment plant, and then also analyze, working with our laboratory staff, the constituents that travel through the wastewater treatment plant to see if there's any updates we should have for our local limits for industrial waste dischargers that involve discharging metals or organic compounds into the wastewater collection system. We also will recommend substantial changes for Title 16 ordinance language, and these substantive changes will require regulatory agency review and approvals. And by this, it's the Regional Water Quality Control Board. We'll have to review any updates we make next calendar year to Title 16 ordinance for substantial changes, and they'll have to review it and give us a decision back that they approve or do not approve of those substantive changes that we plan to make. What we will be doing is incorporating the local limits analysis results, and that may change some parameters that don't require as stringent control of some of the contaminants that come into the sewer system, and that would require our regulatory agency to review and approve that change. Also, US EPA has promulgated dental office pretreatment requirements, and this involves mercury. Apparently, when dentists do fillings and they use silver nanograms to fill teeth, there is some trace amount of mercury involved in that. And these regulations would specify that dental offices need to install devices. These would be centrifuges that would spin this metal material around, separate out the mercury waste, and then they would dispose of that separate to make sure it does not go into the sewer system. There are approximately, from our business license count, there are approximately 200 dental offices in Santa Barbara. And so we need to do some outreach as we watch this proposed regulation go forward. And if it does look as though it's going to be promulgated and become part of our Title 16 ordinance and industrial waste pretreatment program, then we're going to have to assess what impacts there are to us and our staff to get into the regulation of this type of medical waste. And then lastly, there is a discussion that we've had to have our ordinance comport with a lot of other ordinances throughout Southern California on the minimum flow requirements to be classified as a significant industrial user. Currently, our Title 16 ordinance states that any discharger discharging greater than 10,000 gallons per day needs to be considered for this classification, and we're seeking to raise that volume to 25,000 gallons per day. We don't think it has a significant impact on our dischargers anyway, or our regulation of those dischargers in any way, but it puts us more in step with other large communities in Southern California that have that higher limit. And so we'll have to seek the regional board's review and approval to be able to increase that 10,000 gallon per day limit to 25,000 gallons per day. So there are two things that we'll be asking the City Council to approve later this month. And the first one would be that the Council introduce and subsequently adopt by reading of title only an ordinance of the Council of the City of Santa Barbara to repeal and replace Title 16 liquid industrial waste disposal of the Santa Barbara Municipal Code. And that's the ordinance that's before us today with the committee. Now, there will be one additional action that we ask the Council to take, and that will be to adopt by resolution an enforcement response plan. And that is referenced in the ordinance that's before you today. And what that small document does is that it details how the city and city enforcement staff work with industrial users to ensure compliance. And it details standardized steps for our staff to take to ensure compliance and enforcement activities. And in that, it is actually an outreach document to our industrial users that helps them understand how city enforcement activities will proceed if their discharges are not in compliance with Title 16. So that concludes my presentation, and I'm just happy to answer any questions or receive comments that you may have.
Thank you. I was kind of struck by the dental office. Would currently do dentists discharge directly into the system when they're with the rinse water, whatever you call it?
Yes.
It's not treated.
Yes.
And so it seems to me that any medical facility might have this kind of heavy metal discharge at some point. I mean, they've identified dentists because of the practice that they do, but I can think of other medical procedures that probably have the same thing. So, in this case, I mean, do you envision some kind of a collection system at each one of these facilities? That because you say they have to centrifuge it in order to separate out the heavy metals.
Councilmember Rouse, yeah, I've got to come up to speed on it myself, but my understanding would be that they would have to separate that mercury waste and dispose of it as a hazardous material following standardized laws that currently exist for disposal of hazardous material. And I'm not quite sure what that would be, but the goal is to just get this trace amount of mercury that individually from any dentist office isn't very much. But collectively, when you add up all these offices throughout the United States, it's a significant load of this metal that actually enters the water stream downstream. I mean, the public waters downstream. And so the goal is to work with the dental industry to figure out a cost-effective and prudent way to manage that waste. In terms of our non-categorical industrial waste users, we do have Cottage Hospital as an industrial user. They do have an industrial waste discharge permit with the city of Santa Barbara now, and so we control their waste.
So when wastewater comes out of the Cottage facility, then it goes through some kind of process, not necessarily the centrifuge, but there's something it does.
They mostly their permit involves restricting them from discharging certain types of waste into the wastewater treatment system, and there's been a lot of discussion at all levels of government and industry talking about certain viruses that could cause new problems, health risks, and how to deal with those. And so we're working with the industry as a whole on all of that. But Cottage Hospital is in compliance with its requirements for biological waste and any waste that is pathogentic, that they are not supposed to discharge it into the sewer system.
Yeah. I mean, it just seems like the Title 16 seems like it's kind of a catch-all for all sorts of areas that would be larger municipalities with much more heavy manufacturing base. So I guess we're all being swept into the same.
That's what the EPA model ordinance does. This Title 16 update that you're seeing today puts us in the same league with very large municipalities in terms of their regulations. Yeah.
Mr. Hotchkiss.
Do we have any choice in this matter?
Very little choice, no. This is something we're doing to maintain compliance with our regulatory requirements with U.S. EPA and the state boards to ensure that we can continue getting National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System permits for our El Estero wastewater treatment plant. This is something we must do.
How can we ensure that the costs in the case of dentists are not prohibitive?
Well, the rule has been promulgated by U.S. EPA, and as a part of their regulatory process, they have to work with the industries involved to find, hopefully, cost-effective ways in which to manage that waste. I believe that the dentists, I think these small lab centrifuges for dental offices are something on the order of, less than $1,500, and so it's not a huge cost. I think it's just the ongoing maintenance of the equipment and the protocol. This is Ms.
Sorry, I couldn't.
Bjork?
Myself, I was actually hired in 1989 to develop and implement the pretreatment program. So it's something I'm very familiar with, although not as familiar as I was historically. But dental offices, for the most part, do already have separation devices. They've just installed them as good practices. So I do think there will be some effect. Unfortunately, more of the effect will probably be felt by the city in having developed a regulatory program. Most of the dentist offices that I've talked to already have separators. Whether they're going to meet the new requirements or not is another issue, but it's not a new issue for them in terms of understanding the need to manage the waste. I don't know that the 100% will, and we'll have to verify that, but they are certainly well aware of it as an industry. It's been out there for a number of years.
So this won't come as a great surprise, you don't think?
To the dental offices, not to the majority of them, unless, I'm sure that if there are some that are just, operating very much on their own, but if they're associated with any professional associations or anything like that, they should be aware of this. And I think they are. I certainly asked my dentist if he knew about it, and he did.
Can dental offices combine so that not all of them have to pay for the cost of the separator? And
Probably not, because it needs to be on the discharge line from, when you're in the office and they're working on your mouth, it's actually the water that's coming out of your mouth that needs to be dealt with. So.
Okay. Separate question. Of the 25,000 gallon limit you were talking about, could you run that by me, and what does that refer to? 25,000 gallons of water?
Or 25,000 gallons per day of industrial wastewater that would leave that facility and enter the wastewater collection system. And our limit currently is set at 10,000 gallons per day. And we use that as a classification to establish what's in the Title 16 regulation or ordinance as a Tier 1 significant industrial waste user. It's used for a classification to separate a smaller time discharger from a larger time discharger in terms of the volume of their waste. Sometimes an industrial waste discharger could have a fairly dilute waste discharge, but they're discharging so much of it that they're still putting a lot of matter into the collection system every day. And so that's sort of where that number comes in as important.
Does this require any kind of equipment change? Or is it just a paper change?
It's just a regulatory change on how we treat our industrial waste users and how we classify them for enforcement and for permitting.
And in fact, we have very few dischargers who discharge even 10,000 gallons per day of process wastewater. So I'm not sure that we have any that would qualify. I think Mission Linen is the only one who might potentially be in the range. They currently are over the 10,000, but they already have the equipment in place to maintain, operate, and treat their waste.
The staff report says that the ordinance update process will have no budgetary impact on the wastewater fund. Will it have any budgetary impact on any other fund?
No, this update is just coming into compliance with mandatory changes from the federal rule. And so it's fairly extensive in the extent to which it required the ordinance to be redrafted, but the implications for our community, given the nature of our dischargers, we have very few industrial dischargers and very small ones. Really, we probably will see no impact from this in terms of the way we interface with our industrial users.
Will it have, other than dentists, and maybe not much of that, a lot of them?
And I want to say this doesn't address today.
Sorry?
Today's does not address dentists. That's a future.
I see.
A future action.
Does this, if we pass it, which I assume we will, have any effect monetarily on the private sector?
Not beyond what's already there. These industries have been regulated since I think the original pretreatment rules went into place in 1986.
Thank you.
So what we're doing today is I mean, how much of our practices are affected by these changes today, or is this pretty much we're just getting into compliance in terms of the language of our ordinance?
Councilmember, this is pretty much bringing us into compliance and maintaining compliance with our requirements for the ordinance. We are making 55 changes in the document, language changes that keep us in compliance and update us to the EPA model ordinance. We are dealing with 10 additional changes that were a result of our compliance audits over the last 4 or 5 years. And then we've got to make 29 additional changes in the language just to address terminology and other issues associated with the other 2 types of changes. So the vast majority is related to updating our ordinance language to comport with the EPA model ordinance language.
So in other words, our in-the-field practices aren't necessarily affected by this. We're doing like. Did you have a question, Ms. Murillo?
I did, yeah. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thanks so much for your report. So I was just wondering why they gave us so long to comply, since it looks like 2006 was when those standards were put in place.
Well, it has taken us, they came out in 2009, December 2009, for an audit where they gave us recommendations to update our language. And we've been working on it ever since. And we thank you for your support by enabling us to have a contract with Lori Walker and Associates, a consultant that specializes in this type of work. And literally, we've been working with them for the last 4 years to get to this point where we are today.
Okay.
I think to address your question about why so long, we've had 3 different people in the lead role for this position, so I think they've been sensitive to the fact we've had substantial turnover in the staff of this program. And additionally, they're really not substantive changes in
Right,
terms of they're dealing with complying with the letter of the law rather than having any net effect. And I think if they had had more substance to them, the regional board would have had less tolerance in our delay. But because it really is it's more procedural, I think that they definitely want us to get it done. But I think they were less concerned about the delays, although certainly they keep calling our attention to it.
And then I was wondering who the users were that discharged more than 10,000 gallons a day, but you've already discussed that. I know we're not like Oxnard, where they have quite a bit of real hardcore manufacturing down there. I think their Procter & Gamble plant just uses tons of water. But so I'm happy to make a motion, unless, Mr. Chair, you have other questions. I move that the Ordinance Committee forward these changes to the City Council.
Okay, moved and seconded. All in favor?
Aye.
Thank you. Thank you very much.